Welcome to Doctorates of the Absurd, your provider of belief on demand. Today, we are attempting something. Well, something like an intellectual act of demolition.
That's a strong way to put it.
I think it's fitting. We are setting out to tear down one of the most foundational beliefs we have about success, about morality, about what it even means to be a good person.
And that belief is.
The idea that self-control is all about sheer brute force willpower.
Right. And, it might sound like a philosophical parlor trick to challenge that, but the stakes here they're incredibly high.
They really are.
Yeah.
Because the benefit of self-control itself, that's not in dispute at all.
Oh, not at all. As a stable psychological trait, the evidence is just overwhelming. I mean, if you possess high self-control, your life outcomes improve, well, drastically.
In what ways?
You see better physical health, you see greater financial stability and wealth. Higher academic achievement is a big one. And even just higher, more sustained levels of subjective happiness.
So the outcome is great. We all want that. But here's the existential itch, the tension we're really here to scratch today.
Mm-hmm.
We all know what we value in the long term. We have these rational goals, saving money for a down payment on a house, treating consistently for a marathon, or, just trying to maintain a healthy diet.
The big picture stuff.
Exactly. But we are constantly struggling with the immediate visceral pull of desires that are completely incompatible with those goals.
That impulsive urge to splurge on something you don't need.
Or the overwhelming craving for that second or third, or let's be honest, fourth piece of cake.
Right. That struggle is self-regulation. And how we frame that struggle, what we believe the ideal outcome should even look like, that's what determines whether we succeed or fail in the long run.
And for literally millennia, that framing has been dictated by this dominant neo-Aristotelian philosophy that defines good character.
And there's the villain.
That's the villain we're attacking. Because this ancient framework, this thing that tells us how to define virtue and excellence, if it's fundamentally flawed, if it's based on what is basically a psychological fiction.
Then all our modern methods for self-improvement.
All of them. Our New Year's resolutions, our productivity hacks, our life coaching industry, they're all aimed at the wrong target.
The misconception, the core idea we're attacking, is that high self-control is defined by brute effort, by this moral equivalent of constantly flexing a muscle.
The strong person, in this traditional view, is the one who suffers the most and resists the most.
Exactly. They're the hero because they're always in the fight.
And here's the provocative thought that really drives this entire deep dive, and I want you to sit with this for a moment. What if the highly successful, self-controlled people you admire, the ones who seem to effortlessly maintain their discipline, what if they don't actually have more willpower than you do?
What if they just never use it?
What if they never even have to?
That's the tension. That's the core we have to resolve. Because if we can show that effective self-control is actually strategic rather than effortful, then we have to completely overhaul our definitions of virtue itself.
So our mission today is to argue for a radical revision. We're going to use a blend of ancient Greek philosophy, contemporary virtue ethics, and some really hard cognitive psychology.
All to replace the myth of the moral muscle.
With the reality of strategic excellence. We're arguing for something called the indirect harmony hypothesis. Okay, let's unpack this and really establish the intellectual battlefield. To understand why modern psychology is so at odds with this old ideal, we have to first define the ancient Greek concepts that have just fundamentally shaped how everyone, philosophers, and as a result, modern researchers, talks about self-control.
Right. These ideas, they're rooted really deeply in Plato and Aristotle, and they set up what we can call a core binary, an A versus B. And it's really important to remember this distinction served two key roles historically. First, it was a descriptive psychological contrast. It was just describing two different types of people who managed to do the right thing.
Two different paths to the same good outcome.
Exactly. But second, and this is much more important, it was a normative contrast of moral goodness. It was about determining which type of person was ethically superior. The ideal we should all be striving for.
Okay, so let's start with a concept that I think most people intuitively associate with success and having a strong will. Let's talk about continence.
In Greek, that's enkrateia. And it literally means something like self-mastery or holding oneself in.
You can feel the tension in that word.
You really can. Continence defines the struggling hero. This is the person we often praise on social media, the no days off person. This trait is absolutely 100% defined by motivational conflict.
What does that mean in practice?
It means the continent person experiences a significant, active, occurrent desire, a temptation, an urge right now to act against their rational judgment, against what they know is best for them.
But they win.
But they successfully overcome that counter-motivation through sheer effort, through brute force.
So if I know I should go to the gym, but I'm actively, physically resisting the urge to stay on the couch and watch another episode, and I eventually drag myself there anyway, that entire process, that internal wrestling match, that defines me as continent.
Yes. You had to use what we'll call direct self-control.
The white-knuckle approach.
White-knuckle approach, exactly. And this concept is captured so vividly in Western thought by Plato's famous charioteer metaphor, which appears in his dialogue, The Phaedrus.
Yeah, remind us of the visual there. It's a powerful one.
It is. So Plato described the soul as a charioteer. That's the rational part, the driver. And this charioteer is guiding two winged horses. One horse is beautiful, obedient, and it represents the noble, spirited part of us. But the other horse is black, unruly, and it represents our base appetitive desires for food, sex, comfort.
All the fun stuff.
All the fun stuff. And this unruly horse is constantly and violently leaping forward, trying to pull the entire chariot toward immediate, incompatible pleasure.
And the driver's job.
The rational part, the charioteer, has to repeatedly and violently rein in that unruly horse. Plato is very graphic. He talks about yanking the reins so hard that you bloody the horse's tongue and jaws, forcing it back onto its haunches.
Wow. Okay, so that is effortful, painful, direct control. That struggle is the absolute paradigm of continence. You're winning the battle, but you're suffering immensely while you're doing it.
Immensely. Now, contrast that suffering hero with the ideal, temperance. In Greek, that's sophrosyne, and the term is probably better translated as sound-mindedness or even self-knowledge.
Temperance is the spiritual elite, then, the effortless ideal.
Precisely. This trait is defined by motivational harmony or conformity. The truly temperate individual, they lack conflicting desires. Their appetites are aligned perfectly with their best rational judgment.
How is that even possible?
Well, the sources are quite explicit about it. They say, and I'm quoting here, temperate individuals are not even subject to temptation.
So they don't have to fight the unruly horse.
Because it's naturally compliant. Or maybe it's been domesticated over a lifetime of practicing virtue. The point is, they genuinely don't want the chocolate cake when they know they shouldn't eat it. The desire just isn't there for them.
And traditionally, temperance is seen as categorically, ethically superior to just mere continence.
Oh, absolutely. The struggle itself, that psychological conflict, is seen as a deficiency, a stain on the soul. The ideal human doesn't struggle. They just are.
Okay, so this is the essential framework we need to challenge. But before we get to the modern data that blows it up, you said we need to introduce a ground rule, a kind of purity test of our own.
Yes, exactly. We have to introduce our first constraint, one that will dismantle this ancient ideal. Psychological realism.
This is our methodological constraint, right? It demands that any theory about character traits has to be consistent with what living, breathing human beings are actually capable of.
That's right. I mean, if we're going to define traits that are supposed to be virtues, excellences that humans should strive for, they can't be fantastical or mythical. They must be traits that are, and this is a key phrase, measurable by the methods of contemporary psychology and neuroscience.
So if the ideal of the temperate person who feels no temptation, or the perpetually struggling continent person, if those are utterly inconsistent with the empirical data on human motivation and cognition,
then the ideal is useless. It's a standard that humans cannot realistically achieve or sustain without damaging themselves in the process.
And our argument today is going to be that the ideal of temperance is psychologically unrealistic, and the ideal of continence is just inefficient and, frankly, very costly.
Exactly. Let's hold that thought and move to our first major conceptual hurdle.
Okay, so let's start examining the internal conceptual tensions within that traditional philosophical framework. Because even before we bring in modern science, the categories themselves start to break down. They get messy when philosophers try to define exactly what self-control even is.
Right. The first snag we run into is something called the self-control is broad thesis.
What does that mean?
It means that the traditional view even going back to Aristotle, generally acknowledges that self-control involves more than just fighting impulses in the moment.
It's not just the charioteer yanking on the reins.
Correct. It also includes direct strategies like inhibition, that brute resistance, and indirect strategies, things like preemptive forethought, managing your situation ahead of time.
Okay, give me an example of an indirect strategy.
The classic one, the one philosophers absolutely love, is Odysseus tying himself to the mast of his ship.
Right, so he could hear the siren's song without being able to steer his ship onto the rocks.
Exactly. He knew a temptation was coming, and he acted in advance to make it impossible to give in.
Wait a second. I think I see the contradiction already. If self-control requires conflict, which is the absolute definition of continence, how can Odysseus tying himself up be an act of self-control?
You've got it. That's
Yeah.
the problem. He took us strategic action hours, maybe even days, before he was even near the sirens. By the time the desire, the occurrent conflict, actually arose.
I'd already engineered a solution.
Yeah.
The temptation was physically impossible for him to act upon.
Precisely. So if there's no occurrent conflict, how can it be self-control? If we say Odysseus is self-controlled, which he obviously is, then the traditional definition of continence just collapses in on itself.
Okay, so to salvage the definition, philosophers had to clarify. They had to shift the focus from conflict happening right now to conflict that is just anticipated.
That's the move they made. They resolved this tension by shifting the definition of the required conflict from occurrent to foreseeable conflict.
Let's nail down these different desire states for the listener, because this is crucial. Let's use the example of someone trying to avoid eating dessert after dinner.
Perfect. So a current desire. That's the act of desire right now. The waiter just put the dessert menu in your hand, you see the picture of the molten lava cake, and you are actively physically craving it.
Okay, that's the red alert moment.
That's the red alert moment. Then you have standing desire. That's just an inactive disposition. You generally like sweets. You have a standing desire for dessert, even when you're not currently hungry. It's just part of your psychological profile.
Got it. And the third one?
Foreseeable desire. This is the game changer. This is when you accurately predict that you will crave dessert later. For example, you know from experience that about 30 minutes after you finish a huge, savory meal, that conflicting occurrent urge for sugar is going to strike hard.
Okay, so this foresight is what creates the space for a different kind of control.
It creates the space for diachronic control, which just means control across time. This is the highly efficient self-control you exercise in advance against a foreseeable future conflict, even when that desire isn't active right now.
So the weight-conscious person makes a precautionary decision before they even sit down to dinner.
Yes. They pre-order a non-dessert tea, or they ask the waiter not to bring the menu at all, or they even choose a restaurant that they know doesn't serve dessert. The conflicting urge is inert right now, but they're acting against its future self.
So all those indirect strategies, avoidance, pre-commitments, managing your environment, they get classified as self-control because they're exercised against a foreseeable conflict.
Yeah.
That brings Odysseus back into the fold. Good.
It does.
But you said this resolution leads to a fatal tension, a bigger problem.
It does. Because now follow the logic. If high trait self-control, the thing that psychologists measure, the thing that leads to all those beneficial life outcomes, is achieved through the excellent habitual use of these indirect strategies,
Then a highly successful, self-controlled person, let's call them indie for the indirect strategist.
I like that. So indie operates with near-perfect occurrent motivational harmony.
They never struggle in the moment.
Almost never. Because they are masters of preemptive defense, they fireproof the whole house so they don't have to be great firefighters.
Give me a real-world example of indie.
Okay, Indy walks into the office kitchen, and the box of donuts on the counter simply doesn't register as a major temptation. Why? Because they already ate a huge, healthy breakfast an hour ago. Or they purposefully didn't bring their wallet to work that day. Or they've made a habit of working in a different corner of the office, far from the kitchen.
So they are a highly successful, highly self-controlled person, but
But they lack the key defining feature of the traditional trait of continence. Continence requires significant occurrent motivational conflict and a reliance on direct resistance. Indy doesn't have that.
so the category just fails.
Yes.
The old philosophical classification forces us into this absurd position where we have to say that the most successful, disciplined people in the world are not continent because they don't struggle enough.
That's the fatal tension. High trait self-control is not continence. If continence requires that painful daily struggle, the struggle isn't the definition of success. It's the definition of having a less efficient strategy.
And this conceptual instability, this messiness, it's also present on the other side of the binary, right, with temperance.
Absolutely. Some philosophers, most notably John McDowell, tried to maintain a very clear categorical distinction between continence and temperance. He used what became known as the silencing view.
That sounds ominous. What did the silencing view demand?
It argued that to be truly virtuous, truly temperate, you must perceive the world so perfectly, so rationally, that the value of the opposing choice is completely silenced.
What does that mean, silenced?
It means the temperate person doesn't just resist the desire for the second piece of cake. They literally don't recognize or weigh any genuine value in eating it. They look at the cake and they see only cholesterol and future regret. The pleasure is entirely eclipsed, silenced, by their moral judgment.
That immediately sounds like it runs headfirst into our constraint, the psychological realism failure. It's just too austere. It's asking humans to be something they're not.
It really is. I mean, consider a morally complex situation. Let's say virtue requires you, as a police officer, to place yourself in genuine physical danger to save a stranger. That act requires sacrificing a genuine human good, your personal safety, your life, your time with your family.
Of course.
A psychologically realistic agent should feel emotional conflict. They should feel deep sadness or fear or regret because the loss of those things is real and valuable.
Right. If the virtuous police officer felt zero conflict, zero fear, they wouldn't be virtuous. They'd be reckless or, frankly, sociopathic. They would be bordering on psychological deficiency, not moral excellence.
Exactly. And once we accept that virtue can and should involve some emotional conflict, that a person can feel regret or sadness because the foregone option had genuine value, then the distinction between continence and temperance can no longer be categorical. We can't maintain the silencing view.
So the logic bomb explodes fully here. If temperance has to allow for some kind of residual conflict or regret, and continence is defined by a big struggle, the only difference left between them is just the degree or the extent of the motivational conflict they experience.
They are no longer fundamentally different psychic structures, as Aristotle believed. They're just quantitative variants on a single spectrum. And this philosophical breakdown, it sets the stage perfectly for the empirical demolition. We no longer have stable philosophical categories to guide us.
And here is where it gets really, really interesting. We move from this abstract conceptual critique, a logic bomb, to the hard, measurable evidence from cognitive psychology. If the traditional categories are unstable, what do modern psychological measurements actually tell us about the traits of highly successful people?
They tell us that the entire narrative we inherited from Greek philosophy, this story of the struggling, strong-willed hero, is an empirical illusion. The psychological literature confirms pretty unequivocally that high-trait self-control is not continence.
Okay, let's look at the data that shatters this myth. Give me the findings that show the struggling hero is actually the less efficient one.
All right, data point 1, low direct resistance. This is probably the most counterintuitive finding of all. Study after study shows that scores on general trait self-control measures, which predict success in life, are negatively correlated with the actual execution of effortful, inhibitory self-control.
Wait, I need to stop you there. Are you telling me that people who succeed wildly in life don't achieve that success because they are better at that white-knuckle resistance?
That is precisely what the data suggests. Highly self-controlled individuals are not the ones who are demonstrably better at the effortful, in-the-moment resisting of temptation. They don't score high on self-control tests because they win more wrestling matches.
They score high because they just avoid the wrestling match altogether.
They are masters of avoidance. And this plays directly into those classic ego depletion studies, right? The idea that self-control is a limited resource, like a muscle that gets tired after you use it.
Yeah, the idea that if you resist cookies in the morning, you have less willpower for a tough work project in the afternoon.
Exactly. But what's fascinating is what happens to the highly self-controlled people in these scenarios. When they are put in a state of ego depletion and then forced to encounter a temptation, they sometimes perform worse than the low self-control individuals.
How could that possibly be?
Well, the hypothesis is that they are simply less accustomed to needing that brute force. If your whole life is successfully structured to avoid high-conflict situations, you have less practice and perhaps even less raw capacity for that painful, synchronic resistance.
So the people who are forced to fight temptation every single day are, in some weird sense, better trained for the fight.
Even if they are ultimately less successful overall because fighting is so inefficient and costly.
Wow. That is a stunning reversal of the traditional narrative. So the struggle is not a sign of strength or moral superiority. It's a sign of having a less efficient strategy.
That's the interpretation the sources are pushing for. Further studies, the ones using real-time data collection in daily life experience sampling methods, they show that individuals high in trait self-control typically engage less in the actual execution of direct self-control than their less controlled peers. They just use their willpower less often.
Okay, and what about the conflict itself? The definition of continence is having that significant motivational conflict that you then successfully resist.
Right. And this is data point 2. Low occurrent conflict. High trait self-control is correlated with experiencing significantly fewer conflicting desires in their daily lives. And we're talking about objective reports here. Highly self-controlled people just report needing less effortful inhibition. They don't just win the war on desire. They avoid fighting battles altogether because they never allow the temptation to fully manifest as an occurrent desire.
So the implication is just devastating to that ancient ideal. High self-control is achieved by avoiding temptations in the first place, not by winning battles in the moment. The ideal of the continent, struggling, strong-willed person is. It's just psychologically unrealistic for explaining beneficial self-control. That person is struggling because they lack the necessary strategic trait.
This empirical reality forces us to propose a new revisionary model, one that accurately describes the successful person, the one who genuinely achieves superior outcomes. And this is the indirect harmony hypothesis.
Okay, let's solidify this new model of excellence. If we're throwing out continence as the ideal, what does the indirect harmony hypothesis claim defines high trait self-control?
It's a synthesis, really. It takes the best elements of the old models but refines them with psychological realism. It's characterized by 3 connected features.
Okay, number 1.
First, it requires robust standing motivational conflict. This means the person still has a complex motivation structure. They still value dessert or rest or pleasure. The foregone good is still recognized as valuable, so conflict could arise if they were negligent. This is the intellectual depth of the continent person.
Right, they're not a robot. Okay, number 2.
Second, the hallmark trait. An excellent use of indirect strategies. This is proactive planning, pre-commitment, environment management. They are masters of the strategic setup.
And the result of those 2 features is the third one.
Third, they achieve a current motivational harmony. Very low conflict in the moment. This is the efficient, desirable state of the temperate person, but it's achieved through strategic effort rather than some kind of intrinsic mystical purity.
This model seems to align perfectly with all the modern findings, that beneficial habits are what mediate the relationship between self-control and positive life outcomes.
Exactly. High self-control people create these habits like, routinely packing their gym bags the night before or automating their savings transfers, which are essentially a powerful, automatic type of indirect strategy. They foster the avoidance of temptation. They are better adapted to their surroundings because they proactively manage them.
So the continent person is constantly patching holes in a sinking boat with sheer muscle power.
While the indirect harmony person designed the boat not to leak in the first place.
Okay, so now that we understand what the indirect harmony hypothesis is claiming, let's go a layer deeper. Let's talk about the underlying psychological and neurological mechanisms. The traditional view insists self-control must be effortful, but you're arguing that the most effective kind of self-control is nearly effortless. Why is that?
We can understand this through what's called the effort-conflict link.
Yeah.
We need to look at modern theories of mental effort, specifically models like the opportunity cost model. These suggest that effort isn't just some free-floating force, it's regulated by a very specific part of the brain that's designed for one thing: conflict monitoring.
And which area of the brain are we talking about?
The dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, or the DACC. You can think of the DACC as the brain's internal alarm system. It's smoke detector.
Okay.
Its job is simple: to detect when 2 goals are competing for the same resource or action pathway. When this conflict is detected, say, your goal to exercise is actively fighting your goal to stay comfortable and warm, the DACC fires. It detects a high threat signal.
And that signal is what we feel.
That detection increases the control signal, which we experience subjectively as high, taxing, draining effort.
So the exhaustion you feel when you're resisting temptation is the direct result of your brain's conflict alarm going off really, really loudly.
Precisely. And this is where the distinction between synchronic and diachronic control becomes so critical again, specifically in terms of energy consumption and effort cost.
Let's define that cost profile.
Synchronic direct control is inherently and intensely effortful. Why? Because it involves inhibiting an active, occurrent, conflicting desire. The chocolate cake is right there. Your goal to eat it and your goal to diet are fighting a vicious battle. The DACC detects an immediate high-threat signal. You are actively wrestling that unruly horse, and it takes immense energy. It leads to high effort and often that subsequent depletion.
Okay, but the strategic approach, diachronic indirect control, is nearly effortless. Now, I want to know why. Because if I spend, say, 3 hours planning my entire week's meals on a Sunday, that feels like effort to me.
It feels like effort, sure, but it's a profoundly different kind of effort with a dramatically lower cognitive cost per action. Diachronic effort is exerted against a foreseeable desire that is not currently active.
Oh, okay.
When you're planning your meals on Sunday, your brain is not wrestling with the taste and smell of chocolate cake. The potential conflict is inert. It's a hypothetical.
So because the conflict alarm, the DACC detects minimal current threat, the operational cost of the strategy, the intensity of the cognitive control signal needed to execute the planning is very low. You're investing low-cost cognitive effort now to achieve zero-cost motivation later.
This is a crucial clarification. It's not the strategy itself that's effortless, it's the timing of its deployment that makes it low effort. Strategies like situational selection, choosing to study at the library rather than at home where your video game console is, or cognitive change, like reappraising the tempting dessert as a calorie bomb.
Right.
They are near effortless only when used diachronically, before the temptation is active and that alarm starts blaring.
This strategic timing, it seems like it links the indirect harmony trait directly to our underlying neurocognitive structure, specifically executive function, or EF.
It does. Executive function is the umbrella term for all the cognitive processes that manage our goal-directed behavior, things like attention, planning, working memory, and control.
And the traditional view, the idea that high self-control is continence, or brute willpower. That implies that high trait self-control should correlate really strongly with strong inhibition-related executive function. The capacity for direct resistance, for stopping a dominant response.
Right. We use tests like the Stroop test for inhibition. In the classic Stroop task, a subject sees the word BLUE written in red ink, and they're instructed to name the color of the ink, not the word itself.
So you have to inhibit your automatic response, which is to read the word to state the required response, which is naming the color.
And that requires high synchronic effort. You are forcing the stop sign. You're hitting the brakes hard.
But the data doesn't show that, does it?
No. Empirical studies show little to no correlation between self-reported trait self-control and performance on these inhibitory tasks. Highly self-controlled people aren't necessarily better at hitting the brakes. They're not inhibition experts.
So what is the actual confirmed correlation? What cognitive muscle do highly self-controlled people use?
They show a significant positive correlation with shifting specific executive function capacities. In other words, cognitive flexibility. This is the capacity to adapt one's attention, goals, or strategy in response to changing environmental demands.
This is a perfect fit for the indirect harmony hypothesis. The highly self-controlled person is fundamentally a flexibility expert.
Yes.
They are skilled at strategically redirecting their attention and adapting their environment to forestall conflict, rather than just being better at brute force resistance. They're masters of proactive management, not reactive combat. They shift their focus, they shift their location, they shift their strategy.
And this flexibility pays dividends in well-being. There's emerging evidence that frequently deploying effortful synchronic resistance, the defining feature of continence, is negatively correlated with individual well-being.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning it's negatively correlated with subjective happiness and positive affect. You may succeed at resisting the cake for a month, but if you are constantly depleting yourself and agonizing over that decision every single day, you are going to be less happy.
So the willpower hero, the continent man, he may be morally successful by the old metrics, but he is fundamentally less efficient and less happy than the person who is a strategic flexibility expert. The struggle is actually detrimental to flourishing. Okay, so we've established that temperance is psychologically unrealistic for living humans because it demands the silencing of conflict, and continence is empirically inefficient and costly because it demands constant struggle. So if we embrace this new model, indirect harmony, how does this strategic approach fit into our definition of human excellence or virtue?
Well, before we can place it, we have to address a very compelling philosophical counterargument. Some ethicists argue very powerfully for the necessity of conflict. They actually claim that continence is ethically superior, precisely in those rare, difficult cases where important human goods conflict with each other.
I can see why. It's the classical ethical dilemma.
Right. Let's use a famous high-stakes scenario. Imagine a husband and wife are in a severe car accident. The husband is relatively uninjured. His wife is mildly injured. She's clearly in pain, and she needs immediate comforting. Beside the car, however, is a complete stranger who is severely injured and is likely to die without immediate high-risk intervention from the husband.
And virtue, I presume, demands that the husband help the severely injured stranger first, based on the recognition that all human life is equally valuable and the immediate need is greater there.
Exactly. Now, the philosopher arguing for continence would say that if the husband immediately and effortlessly turned away from his wife to help the stranger, he would be deficient.
Why? He did the right thing.
Because he must feel the profound desire for the foregone good. He has to feel that deep, intimate pull to comfort and protect his wife first, and he has to resist it. Only by resisting that deep, loving desire does he fully recognize the genuine value that was lost in sacrificing that immediate connection for the sake of the stranger.
That's a powerful argument for struggle being necessary for moral recognition. The struggle itself proves he cared enough about both values.
It is compelling, but it suffers from the crucial error we identified earlier in our deep dive. It equivocates on the type of conflict.
How so?
The argument successfully supports the necessity of robust standing motivational conflict. The husband must have a deep standing desire, a constitutive part of his moral and psychological profile, to help his wife first because he genuinely loves her. If he felt nothing, he would be deficient in his capacity for love and fidelity.
But the argument doesn't support the necessity of a current motivational conflict, the in-the-moment paralysis, the agonizing struggle, which is what actually binds continence.
Correct. The ethically optimal trait requires the individual to have that standing value profile, but it does not require that they be paralyzed by struggle in the moment. In that crisis, the individual with indirect harmony, who has trained themselves through strategic reflection and planning, can immediately and effectively deploy their internal strategic toolkit.
Like what, though? What strategies are useful in a sudden emergency like that?
Well, diachronic control strategies can be practiced. Things like quickly and strategically framing the situation, reminding himself of his broader moral values, or using attention redirection to focus solely on the immediate, necessary, life-saving steps for the stranger.
And this strategy ensures that his stronger, current desire, the one that translates into immediate action, is to help the stranger, the action he judges best.
Without having to waste critical time agonizing over the internal conflict.
So indirect harmony is actually the ethically optimal trait because it combines the best elements of both of the old worlds. The efficiency of temperance with the psychological depth of continence.
Precisely. It maintains a current motivational harmony, that efficient, low-conflict state that's crucial in a crisis, but it simultaneously incorporates robust, standing motivational conflict, that complex value recognition we celebrate in the continent person, by requiring the individual to have exerted effort in foresight, planning, and maintaining that complex ethical value system over time.
So the critical difference is just where the effort is placed. It's moved from the costly, last-second, highly aversive, synchronic resistance of continence
to the lower-cost, more flexible diachronic planning and setup of indirect harmony.
So this strategic effort, the foresight, the planning, the avoidance, that's the true low-cost path to excellence that is genuinely psychologically realistic for living humans. That's the real virtue.
It is, and it forces us to reject this long-standing philosophical idea that brute resistance is the highest moral good. Excellence lies not in how well you struggle, but in how skillfully you structure your life so you don't have to struggle at all.
This means the goal isn't to build a stronger will. The goal is to build a smarter strategy.
That's the entire paradigm shift right there. We're moving from the model of the warrior who's constantly battling the world to the model of the architect who perfectly designs the environment. Hashtag outro. You know, we've spent this deep dive replacing the myth of the moral muscle, this constantly struggling hero, with the reality of strategic foresight. High-trait self-control, empirically speaking, is less about fighting fires in the heat of the moment and significantly more about fireproofing the environment.
It's about automating good choices, establishing beneficial habits long before the flame ever starts.
Right. The struggle itself isn't the point. The successful outcome, achieved through strategic efficiency, that's the point.
And we can summarize the complete failure of the old philosophical framework, a framework that has defined self-improvement for centuries, with this really powerful summation from our sources.
The old categories are just broken because they're based on psychological fictions. They don't map onto reality.
And the quote is, "If my revisionary proposals are on the right track, then an empirically adequate account of trait self-control does not line up neatly with the traditional distinction between continence and temperance."
We simply cannot use those ancient boxes anymore. They don't fit.
So the realization that successful self-control requires flexible strategy, not just brute willpower, it opens up entirely new and, frankly, far more effective avenues for self-improvement. It's what we call the toolbox approach.
Instead of just having one tool, the hammer of willpower, you have a whole set of sophisticated instruments.
We should stop asking ourselves how to be stronger in the face of temptation, which just puts us on this road to depletion and misery. Instead, we should embrace the efficiency of indirect harmony, and we should start asking a much better question.
How do I become so strategically excellent that the temptation never even registers?
That is the path to low-cost, high-yield success.